Thank you. Thank you so much. Can you guys hear me all right? All right. Thank you for inviting me, Chris. Thank you so much for having me back. I really appreciate it. One of the questions I keep getting is like, you came all the way from Texas just to talk about the Civil War? And I said, yeah, why not? Why not come to Antietam if you have the chance and extra airline miles? So here I am. So I appreciate it. And just to share a personal note, last fall I was diagnosed with cancer. I'm much better now. But this is kind of a reward to myself, you know, for getting through that, battling through the illness and all the things you have to go through. And some of you probably know what I'm talking about. So it's a pleasure to be here. And some days it's a pleasure to be anywhere. But it's especially a pleasure to be here speaking to you good people about the 5th Texas. So up here, just to give you some context, there's 3 important images that I want to show. The first is a plaque in Independence, Texas, which is northwest of Houston in Washington County. It's a plaque in Texas that designates where one of the companies of 5th Texas was formed. The middle picture is a depiction of Lieutenant Colonel John Upton of the 5th Texas. He's mortally wounded carrying the regimental standard at 2nd Manassas by Don Triani. And the last one, of course, is the Texas marker here at Antietam. And because I'm from Texas, I can say this. I love Texas, and I love these markers. They're beautiful, but they are impossible to read. And they're everywhere. You see, there's at Gettysburg, the same rose granite. They put them everywhere, and they're beautiful, but they're terrible to read. But, you know, it is what it is. It's a Texas thing, and I'm going to say that many times tonight as we go through this talk. So, before we get started, I want to do a quick thought experiment with you guys. So let's just say, for example, we wanted to collectively write a book about Antietam. We said, like, yeah, Scott Hardwick, he did okay. It was a fine book. It was all right. But I think we could do one better. Now, shout out, like, what are the elements we would have to include? If you wrote a book about Antietam, what are the pieces that you absolutely must tell? So, anybody?
Cornfield.
The cornfield. Anybody?
Sunken Road.
The sunken road. Burnside's Bridge, absolutely. So there's just pieces, if you told that story, you absolutely have to do it, right? So Hooker's attack in the morning towards the Dunkard Church. You would have to include Burnside's attack at the bridge, the fight at the Bloody Lane, the struggle for the West Woods, and of course Hood's attack or counterattack at Farmer Miller's cornfield is an imperative. The story of Hood's brigade has become so intertwined and part of the story of the Battle of Antietam. To tell one without telling the other is like committing historical blasphemy. In fact, Hood's Texas Brigade has become one of the most famous infantry units the war ever produced. And I was doing research on this, and I thought, well, hopefully I can find enough information. I stopped counting at 25 books written specifically about the Texas Brigade or parts of the Texas Brigade or Hood. It's incredibly well documented. Now, tonight we're going to talk about just the 5th Texas. And when I say the 5th Texas, I also mean the 1st Texas and the 4th Texas, because they were all together. And when I say the Texans, I'm also including all of those people. So don't be confused if I just say, well, the 5th Texas did this, the 4th and the 1st were right there with them. Now, this picture is of a 1911 monument that was erected to Hood's Texas Brigade in Austin, Texas. It was also the 39th annual reunion of the Texas Brigade, and chairman of the Monument Committee and former member of the brigade and author Frank B. Chilton, who's there on the right, was lamenting. He was afraid that the world was going to somehow forget Hood's Texas Brigade. And in that light, during the dedication for this monument, he wrote the following poem, and it goes like this. Brother, when our cannons, or who shall be the standard bearer and answer here for Hood's Texas Brigade? Brother, when our cannons are rust are, our comrades dust are, who shall pierce the tears and laughter of the days to come hereafter? With the telling of the story, who's the triumph and glory? Who shall be the chiefest in the vanguard? And who shall wave Hood's Texas Brigade standard? Very moving words, right? So by the end of this talk, we hope to answer his question, has the world forgotten Hood Texas Brigade? And telling you a little bit more about the 5th Texas. And of course, as he mentioned, the title of this talk is from the Brazos to the Antietam, and the Brazos is a river that runs just west of Houston. And these are two members of the 5th Texas Infantry, Myers and Rufus Cousins, who were in Company E. So before we get to that, let's talk about Texas in the Civil War. Just to give some context and some background. So Texas declared its secession from the Union on February 1st, 1861, and joined the Confederacy on March 1st. The population of Texas in 1860 was only 604,000 individuals, representing almost twofold increase since 1850. So immigration and people relocating from other states had almost doubled the size of the population in those 10 years. The breakdown was 421 free peoples and 182,000 enslaved people. 72% of all Texans were either farmers, farm laborers, merchants, stock raisers, and so forth. And this is reflected in the regiments as it was in many other Southern regiments. Texas sent nearly 90,000 men to war, and over 24,000 Texans died before it was over. Now, depending on how you count it, if you look at the 90,000 men who signed up to serve in the Texas, for the Texas military, that represents somewhere between 60 and 70% of the men of military age in the state of Texas at the time. White freedmen, of course. And this means two things, right? We know that because of slavery, that the Southerners were able to send more men north and to fight and into the Army than they would have normally. But it also shows an interesting aspect of Texas that fully, like I said, almost 7 out of every 10 men of military age between the ages of 15 and 50 joined the Army to serve. Texas committed 45 regiments of cavalry, 23 regiments of infantry, 12 battalions of cavalry, 4 battalions of infantry, 5 heavy artillery batteries, and 30 field artillery batteries to the Confederacy. Now, that's kind of backwards. You don't usually see that many cavalry regiments coming from a specific state, but just keep in mind, most of those fought as infantry regiments. Every Texas boy wanted to be in the cavalry, and they said, okay, that's fine. However, leave your horses here. You can be called cavalry dismounted, but you're going to fight as infantry. And so a good number of those 45 regiments of cavalry fought as infantry. Majority of these troops served in the west of the Trans-Mississippi. The biggest collection of Texans that fought in one specific battle was at Vicksburg. And other than several futile attempts to take Texas via the Gulf Coast, Texas was largely untouched by the war. Now let's do a little bit more background. This is the 1860 census, and according to that, 36% of the residents of Texas were actually born in the state, about 1/3. Almost half of the residents from Texas emigrated from one of the slave states, and only 6% of Texans were born in non-slave states. 10% of Texans were born outside the country, with half of those being from one of the Germanic countries, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So this is a product of the Missouri Compromise, meaning that if you were in one of the existing slaveholding states and you wanted to go to the Trans-Mississippi to start a new life, they were giving away land, you would go to a state like Texas. Now, if you look at somewhere like Iowa, it was exactly the opposite. Iowa was heavily populated by folks from the north, and hardly anybody from the south immigrated to Iowa. So the 5th Texas was recruited in southeast Texas in June of 1861. The original muster was 800 men. The brigade that it belonged to, that eventually would belong to, included the 1st and 4th Texas, the 18th Georgia, and Hampton's Legion joined after the Battle of the 7 Days, and then the 3rd Arkansas after Antietam. When the Army of Northern Virginia surrendered in April of 1865, the 5th Texas counted 12 officers and 149 men in its rank and file. And next to it is a list of all the battles that they fought in. That's a pretty extensive list. You can imagine that almost every significant battle in the Eastern Theater and some in the Western Theater, the 5th Texas was there. A little bit more about their background and who they were. So they were recruited from these 7 counties in southeast Texas: Harris, Colorado, Leon, Walker, Washington, Milam, and Polk counties. And then hopefully you can see the arrows. The top one is Austin and Houston. So this is kind of southeast coastal region of Texas. The chart to the right lists the original companies, the company commanders, and their nicknames, which were often very colorful. Pay attention to some of those names because they'll be coming up later on in the presentation. One other interesting thing that I want to talk about, the Texans and the folks from 5th Texas. So if you look at how the secession vote broke down in February of 1861, the 7 counties that were made up for the 5th Texas voted 85% to 15% basically to secede from the Union. So they were heavily invested in secession. They were heavily invested for the cause of the Confederacy. Now, one other thing to note, I mentioned the German people. Those brown counties you can see on the Texas map, those were counties that voted not to secede. And one thing they had in common is they were heavily populated by German immigrants, as I mentioned before. And a lot like the German immigrants that came to Maryland and Pennsylvania, they were not crazy about the Confederacy. For the most part, there were exceptions, of course. They weren't crazy about slavery, and they weren't interested in secession. So there's a lot of still influence in those counties based on the German immigrants who came there. So after being mustered in, the 20 companies that would eventually form the 5th and 4th Texas assembled and began training at Camp Van Dorn near Houston. Sergeant Benjamin Baker of Company B wrote home lamenting the conditions and the men's general mood. He said, "When I reflect that Colorado stands foremost in wealth, I feel sorry that we received so little encouragement. Nonetheless, all the men are in good spirits as they became not unwilling servants of Uncle Jeff." And basically what he's saying, he's complaining that Colorado was a rich county and his uniforms and the accoutrement that they had wasn't as nice as somebody else's. So an interesting sentiment. However, he said they were willing to go and fight. Now, initially, the Confederate government wanted all Texas regiments to stay in the West, arguing that because of the vulnerable Texas coast and how large Texas was, they needed all those men to defend Texas. However, Louis Wigfall on the left, who was a former U.S. senator, insisted that Texas be represented in what he felt would be the principal theater of the war, and that was the East. And so these 20 companies were sent east. On August 16th, 1861, they departed Texas for Virginia. The 1st Texas had left about a month before. And here we have some special effects. You'll like these. So they would travel over 1,400 miles by foot, by cart, by wagon, and 8 different railroads. So again, 1,400 miles. They traveled the farthest of any Confederate troops to join the army in the East. Now, these hard-fighting men from the far-flung frontier awed the people of the East, and the stories of the Texas Rangers, the Alamo, the Texas War for Independence, and the Mexican War steeped these men in a mystique that captivated the people of the East. Sergeant Smither of Company D wrote home about the reception the Texans received while making their way to Virginia. He wrote, "We are a perfect curiosity on the road. People would come from every direction to see the boys from Texas, and they had great ideas of the Texans." So there was this mystique of something was about these Texans. We don't know what it is. I don't know if they're 10 feet tall, if they have 2 heads, but we need to go and check them out because they're certainly unusual. Now, the 20 companies that traveled east were formally organized into the 2 regiments, the 4th and the 5th. The 5th Texas spent the winter of 61 and 62 in winter quarters between Neabsco and Powell Creeks, northeast of Dumfries, Virginia. You can see that's the arrow right there on the map. About halfway between Fredericksburg and Washington, D.C. Now, like a lot of regiments in the war, like almost every single regiment in the war, sickness and disease began to take their toll. Remember, the original muster was 800 men a few months before. Now here they largely continued to train, and they traded in their hodgepodge of miscellaneous weapons that they brought with them for Enfield rifles that were issued by the Confederate government. Now in October, Jefferson Davis, after experimenting with a lieutenant colonel of German descent, who was basically run out of camp, appointed James J. Archer as first colonel of the 5th. So the Texans were really adamant about having someone from Texas or tangentially connected to Texas commanding them. And so anybody who wasn't was basically, like I said, run out of camp. Archer was born in Maryland to a wealthy military family. He attended Princeton University, Bacone College in Georgetown, and the University of Maryland. He went on to become a lawyer. He fought in the Mexican War, lived in Texas for a time, so he qualified. And in 1855, he joined the regular army as a captain in the 9th U.S. Infantry. Now, Wigfall, the senator, secured an appointment to the 1st Texas Regiment, and after rapid promotion was made commander of the brigade. Now, during that winter, what would happen is Wigfall, who apparently drank a lot, go figure, he's a senator, he drinks a lot, and he would wake the men up in the middle of the night imagining Yankee invasions coming across the border, and after a while they go like, okay, this isn't going to work out, he's apparently got some problems, let's send him up to the government. And so he was made a Texas senator for the Confederacy, and John Bell Hood was made the Texas Brigade commander. Now, in March 1862, the brigade hereafter, called Hood's Texas Brigade, responded to McClellan's advance up the Virginia Peninsula. The brigade was added to Whiting's division as part of the reserve corps. It was reserve troops from the District of Acquia under Major General Gustavus Smith. And after performing some picket duties near Yorktown, the regiment's first action was at a place called Eltham's Landing. And that's right there. So this is their baptism of fire, the Battle of Eltham's Landing, or the Battle of Barnesville, or the Battle of West Point, or pick your name. It's got like 5 or 6. The regiment now mustered 341 men. So remember, they started out with 800, and that's how many men they lost to sickness and disease. They were at less than half strength by the time they fought their first battle. In May of 1862, in New Kent County, Virginia, William Franklin's Union Division landed at Eltham's Landing, and their goal was to cut off the Confederates Joe Johnston's army, who was advancing up the peninsula. They were retreating away, withdrawing from the Williamsburg line, and their goal was to cut it off. And the Whiting's command was sent to stop them, and they did. They stopped them dead in their tracks. In this very small affair, the 5th suffered 2 killed, 3 wounded, and 3 captured. But it was their baptism of fire. And this is the map of Eltham's Landing, and you can kind of see, it's hard to see a little bit of the insert there, but that's where the Texans were when they fought at Eltham's Landing. Now, the Texans' reputation started to grow. Jefferson Davis said, "They saved the rear of our army and the whole of our baggage train." Smith wrote, "The Texans won immortal honor for themselves, their state, and their commander. General Hood at the Battle of Eltham's Landing near West Point, with 40,000 men, I would not hesitate to invade the North, or such men, I would not hesitate to invade the North, and would before winter make them sue for peace on our terms, or destroy their whole country." So again, the reputation of the Texans seemed to grow, if somewhat unwarranted. So, skip ahead to Seven Pines. So the Battle of Seven Pines, also obviously known as the Battle of Fair Oaks. The 5th was lightly engaged as part of Longstreet's line, and they suffered light casualties. Now, it's hard to see with this map, but if you look at the very upper left, that's where Smith's men were, and the Texans were part of that unit. So they were lightly engaged at Seven Pines. However, the regiment, again, was feeling like it's like most new regiments going into battle. Hey, this is it. We're finally getting our chance to prove what we can do. And Private Campbell of Company A later wrote, "By 9 a.m., the long roll beat, and the double quick we started for Richmond. But nearing it, we passed around and took the road leading towards the Chickahominy Swamp. Hardly we passed to the right before the boom of cannon and the roar of musketry broke upon the still air. Going to have a frolic. Now we can dance the war dance, boys," and that's Private Campbell of Company A. So as we go on through the war, you can see this sentiment is going to change, right? They're enthusiastic, they're going to war like all young men, they're very excited, and this would change very quickly. Now, Archer was promoted in June, and Jerome Bonaparte Robertson, the commander of Company I, was now made colonel, colonel number 2. The son of Scottish immigrants, Robertson was born in Kentucky in 1815, and you're going to begin to see a pattern of all these men who are born in other states, immigrated to Texas, and now are officially Texans and would take over the regiment. He was studying medicine, and he moved to Texas to join the fight for Texas independence in 1835. Buying land and settling in Washington on the Brazos, he established a medical practice and became known on the frontier as an Indian fighter. So Washington on the Brazos is a picture of one of the homesteads there. It's a state park now, and that's where the Texas Declaration of Independence was signed. And so it was a very important piece of Texas history. He was elected to the Texas House of Representatives in 1947. He served in the Texas State Senate 2 years later. He became a delegate to the State Secession Convention in 1861 and raised a company of volunteers, the Texas Aids, becoming its captain. All right, so we're still in the midst of the 7 days, but let's talk a little bit about the Shenandoah. In June, after Joe Johnston's wounding, Robert E. Lee took command, and of what was now became known as the Army of Northern Virginia. And one of his first acts was to send several units into the valley, including Hood's brigade. So we know Jackson has been operating in the valley since March, and part of his operational objective was to keep men off the peninsula, to keep McClellan from being reinforced. Lee knew that McClellan read the Richmond papers as well as the Union High Command, so he purposely sent units into the valley, putting that information into the paper, planning it so that McClellan would read it. So the unit the brigade would travel over 400 miles in less than a month, only to find themselves back at Richmond at the start of the 7 days. So before they got into the Battle of the 7 Days, they went on a 400-mile hike into the valley and back. Private Campbell noted before the march began, soon tents in wagons, blankets and haversacks, rifles on our shoulders, we were ready to go wheresoever the powers that were decided. All right, so we're skipping along to the 7 days, and I promise we'll get to Antietam here shortly. So the first major action that the 5th was involved was Gaines's Mill. So on June 27th, the third battle of the 7 days was Gaines's Mill. Now, following an inconclusive battle at Beaver Dam Creek, Lee renewed his attack against the right flank of the Union Army, which was Fitzjohn Porter's corps, and he had established a defensive line behind Bosun's Swamp north of the Chickahominy River, and that's where Lee had attacked him. The Confederates mounted one of the largest attacks of the war, 57,000 men approximately, and at dusk the Confederates assaulted Porter's line and drove his men back to the Chickahominy. Now the Texas Brigade attacked, breaking the Federal line and driving it back and sweeping away the second line as well. The 5th Texas, and it's hard to see from this insert, but the 5th Texas is one of the deepest penetrating units in that line. They suffered 76 casualties as a result of this battle, including 13 dead, 62 wounded, and 1 missing. Their next before we get to that, comments on the Battle of Gaines's Mill. So Private Petty of Company E stated, it seemed that the whole heaven had grown suddenly angry and was raining bursting bombs and shells and bullets. Once fired, never seemed to cease to fly. Before the battle, Captain John Kerr, regimental adjutant, opined, today we expect some of the heaviest fighting of our lives. And he was correct. Now, at Malvern Hill, 4 days later, the Texans occupied the extreme left of the Confederate line and were exposed to artillery fire all day. So if you look at where this says McClellan, the 5th Texas was right up there. They suffered 2 killed and 52 wounded in this action, but they weren't heavily engaged. However, Private Stevens of Company K said, this was our awful condition. From 9 a.m., say 12 hours, we lay under the rays of the blazing sun. And there we lay. And they were subject to artillery fire all day. Now, by July 8th, the 5th was marching back to Richmond, and soon they would find themselves heading north. On July 26th, Brigadier General Whiting went on sick command, and Hood assumed command of the division as he was a senior brigade commander, and the division was assigned to Longstreet's command. Now that brings us to 2nd Manassas. So on August 30th, the 300 men of the 5th Texas had their bloodiest fight to date, with the Texas Brigade leading Longstreet's attack on Pope's left flank, crossing Young's Branch and overrunning the 5th New York, and that's represented, as you said at the beginning of the presentation, with this painting of Lieutenant Colonel John Upton. He was carrying the 5th Texas flag and is mortally wounded. Pope suffered 16,000 casualties. At 2nd Manassas, Lee suffered 9,000. However, the 5th Texas was the most engaged of Hood's men. They suffered 260 casualties, over 86%, more than any other regiment in Lee's army. So compare that. So they didn't receive as many casualties in Antietam, but at 2nd Manassas, they took a real beating, and this would affect their performance as we move into the Maryland campaign. A couple other things about 2nd Manassas. One Texan recalls discovering a wounded comrade on the field. He wrote, as the litter bearers raised him up and surveyed the ground, he surveyed the ground, helpless and feeble from the loss of blood, from a fearful wound, he exclaimed, my God, so many dead around. It seems, had I done my duty faithfully, as I should have done, I too would be dead and not simply wounded. A very noble sentiment of a boy after being shot down in the thickest of the fight. Now, Colonel Robinson was wounded in the groin to add to a shoulder wound he sustained at Gaines's Mill. Captain Bryan took over for him, but was wounded almost immediately. Captain Turner took over from there, but after a short recovery, Robinson resumed command of the regiment as Lee contemplated his first invasion of the North. William Wofford of Georgia was now made brigade commander. All right, how are we doing on time? Pretty good. All right, so that brings us to the Maryland campaign. Now, I'm going to assume most of you guys know the story. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the details. If you don't, then I don't know how to help you. I'm just kidding. We are going to talk about something that's very relative. But on September 6th, the 5th Texas crossed the Potomac with the rest of Lee's army. As Lee worked to capture the garrison at Harper's Ferry, Hood's men were sent northeast with the rest of Longstreet's command to Boonesboro, as we know, and then subsequently to Hagerstown. By September 13th, a week after entering Maryland, the men of the 5th found themselves a mere 6 miles south of the Pennsylvania state line. Now, before they crossed at White's Ford, John Stevens of Company K recalled the regiments passing through Leesburg, Virginia, in the late evening of September 4th. He wrote, "The houses were brilliantly lighted up with extravagant number of candles in the windows and the sides of the streets. The streets were crowded with ladies and children. Many a God bless you was spoken out. And when the Lone Star flag was recognized, someone in the crowd shouted, 'Hurrah for the Texas Brigade.'" And this, of course, is the 5th Texas flag. Now, as they moved into Maryland and they marched through Frederick on September 10th, there was an excited young boy who asked his mother if the soldiers passing by were Texicans. And after his mother's positive affirmation, the boy declared, "Oh, Mama, they look just like our folks." So again, who knows what this boy was expecting to see? Men 10 feet tall, wearing buckskin, nobody knows, but he was very excited to learn that they looked just like normal people. One elderly woman in the crowd called out to the rough-looking Texans, "Lord bless your dirty, ragged souls." So kind of goes to the theory that Lee's men, especially the Texans, were ragged, dirty, and had seen some hard fighting before they got to Maryland. Now, as Lee began to carry out the plans in Special Orders 191, the capture of the Harper's Ferry garrison, Longstreet's command, as I mentioned, was sent to Boonesboro with a reserve supply trains, and then it subsequently moved to Hagerstown to secure supplies and possibly respond to a Union force in Pennsylvania. Now, on September 13th, after Lee learned that McClellan was advancing at the South Mountain Passes, he ordered Longstreet's command to return to Turner's and Fox's Gap to support D.H. Hill. They started out on the 14th before dawn. Now, before we get into the Battle of South Mountain, I want to talk about one incident that's part of the Texas Brigade lore, right? So Hood, his men had captured some ambulances after 2nd Manassas. General Nathan Evans decided he wanted those and ordered Hood to give them up. Hood said, "Go pound sand, I'm not giving them to you," and Evans had Hood arrested. And Hood was forced to march at the end of his division. And at some point as they're marching to South Mountain, as the story goes, the Texans called out to Lee as they passed by him and said, "Give us Hood, give us Hood." And so Lee went to Hood and said, "Hey, if you say you're sorry, we'll just kind of forget the whole thing." And Hood's like, "Nope, not happening." And he said, "Okay, well, just go ahead anyway, and we'll sort this out later." And the men began to cheer, and you can see this represented in this painting. The men of the 5th Texas claimed that they were the ones who persuaded Lee to give them Hood and say, "Down with Nathan Evans." Who knows? It could have been the whole brigade, it could have been the 1st, but, when they have important things a part of history, everybody wants to be a part of it, right? So, South Mountain. It was a warm day, and Longstreet had lost about half of his force, about 7,800, due to men falling out of the march. How much of it was heat? How much of it was Lee's army was tired, hungry, and worn out? Who can say? They arrived at about 2:30 p.m., but Hood's men did not reach their position at Fox's Gap, and this is a homemade map of mine, until 5 or 5:30. Initially, they were sent north of the National Pike, and then as the fight at Fox's began to turn against the Confederates, they were sent over to Fox's Gap to support. 5 Confederate brigades had been battling elements of the Union 9th Corps, and Hood came in and worked to shore up the battered Confederate line. He ordered his command to fix bayonets and drive the Yankees back. This consolidated the line as darkness fell, and you can see that's Hood's men coming in there on the top. Now, Hood's men kept up a desultory fire until the growing darkness. And Jesse Rito, yet another part of Texas lore, depending on who you talk to, ordered the 51st Pennsylvania forward, which drew the Texans' fire, and Reno was hit and soon died, as we know. Now, the Texans claimed that they were the ones who shot Reno. Of course, the North Carolinians claimed they were the ones who shot Reno. And then there was also a claim that the 35th Massachusetts were the one who shot Reno by accident. So, again, who can say? However, during the night, the Confederates, along with the 5th Texas, slipped away, and they would guard the rear of Lee's army as he advanced back towards Antietam Creek. According to official reports, the regiment suffered 4 wounded and 6 missing at Fox's Gap. However, in my research, I did come along a book. It's called Hood's Defeat near Fox's Gap. Are you guys familiar with this book? I think a local author wrote it. Older is his name. He claims that Hood suffered more casualties, more like 400, and actually fought his stand further west on the mountain. Now, It's a very interesting book. If you get a chance, check it out. But it does run counter to a lot of the official accounts of what happened at Fox's Gap. One of the regimental soldiers, Private Stevens, who was sent by an officer behind a stone wall to watch for enemy movements, lamented. He said, I want to stay right here. I got the biggest scare of the war, and it appeared to me that I was large as an ox. So again, he was out there on his own, felt like he was a big target and not enjoying himself at all. So this brings us to Captain Isaac Newton Moreland Ike Turner, not the same Ike Turner of Ike and Tina Turner fame. He took over command of the regiment after Robinson collapsed from the heat on the way to Fox's Gap. Robinson was the regimental commander. He was born in Georgia in 1939. His father, Joseph Turner, was a plantation owner. The Turner family moved to Texas before the outbreak of the Civil War. He helped organize and train a mounted artillery company of Polk County volunteers for the Confederacy, and he was elected captain in 1861. And this eventually became Company K of the 5th Texas. He was the youngest commander in Hood's Texas Brigade at the age of 23. So again, they were originally going to be an artillery unit, but they were switched over to infantry, and suddenly this 23-year-old is thrust into command. He had 3 younger brothers who also served in the 5th Texas, William, Joseph, and Charles. Now, if we have time at the end, I want to tell you some more about Ike Turner after the war, but we'll get to that if we have time. All right, Antietam, September 17th. Again, without going into all the details, we're going to focus in specifically on Hood's men and the 5th Texas. So on the 15th, the Texas, who were the rear guard for Lee's army, arrived just west of the Antietam, right around 11 a.m., according to Hood, and were initially posted at the Boonesboro Turnpike just west of the creek. Now, almost immediately, they were ordered to cover the left side of the line as Lee attempted to show his men as many places on the line as he could. And this is one of my other homemade maps. Now, late in the afternoon, on the 16th, the 1st Army Corps, led by George Meade's division, crossed the Antietam and moved south. Hood's men moved forward to meet them. Wofford's brigade advanced and formed a line south of the cornfield, its left on the Hagerstown Pike. The 4th Texas deployed as skirmishers and encountered the advance of Seymour's brigade. However, reinforced by the 5th Texas on its right, they drove the Federals back and held the East Woods until darkness put an end to the engagement. Now, once the shooting was over, and you can see that little insert, the 5th Texas was on the very far right, right of the line. Now, once the fighting was over, you guys know the story, Hood appeals to Lee and he says, my men are tired, they're hungry, can you please allow us to come off the line and draw rations? Lee sends him to Jackson, and Jackson says yes, and we're all familiar with Jackson's caveat. He says, you must come, though, if I call for you. So at 10 p.m., the brigade was relieved by Lawton's command and withdrew to the woods west of the Dunker Church. And by the way, a lot of these modern day photos are mine, so my wife always reminds me to tell people that, so I always forget. If she was here, she'd be reminding me right now. So before dawn on September 17th, the exhausted 5th, with the rest of Hood's men, stirred from their sleep and began to cook their breakfast. And this was the first authentic meal they had received in several days. Hood, for his part, had been searching all night for the commissary wagons, and one report says all he could find was flour, while another indicates they received a small amount of bacon and some vegetables they procured from some of the local farms. Now, before dawn broke, the battle had begun, obviously, and shells began landing among the men of the 5th. And so you can see where Hood's men were at. They were near the Dunker Church, so probably a little bit south, a little bit west, in a position there. Now, Hooker's assault, launched at dawn, slowly but steadily began to collapse Jackson's 2 division holding the left side of the line. And at 7 a.m., after almost 2 hours of desperate fighting, Lawton called for support. And Hood's hungry, tired, and now livid division begrudgingly assembled and poured out of the woods. Of course, they were very upset because they didn't get to eat their breakfast, or so the story goes. They crossed the pike and formed along the Smoketown Road. And we're going to see some different maps. This is one that I pulled from the interwebs. It's a very confusing map, so sometimes it's hard to look at these. But Hood orders the division forward to drive the Federals back in an ever-increasing artillery and musket fire. He deployed Law to the right, those 2 divisions, Law and Wofford. He deployed Law to the right and Wofford to the left. The Texans advanced into the cornfield, driving the Federals out before running headlong into Gibbon's men, the Iron Brigade, supported by close-range artillery. Campbell's battery. Hood's men were being systematically decimated by concentrated fire, but still they came on, and that's, of course, the first Texas we know that goes to a path on the left, and their famous stand there in the cornfield. Now, Walford's brigade, and sometimes I have a hard time pronouncing his name, was initially on the left and Law on the right. However, seeing something he didn't like in Law's front, possibly Christian's brigade of Ricketts' 1st Corps Division, Hood ordered the 5th to the right on a formation consisting of the 4th Alabama of Law's brigade and the 21st Georgia of Trimble's brigade. And they drove steadily into the east woods. Now, one account speculates he saw the lead elements of Mansfield's 12th Corps advancing, but however, the most important thing is this action essentially splits the division into 3 parts. You can see the middle position going through the cornfield, the Texans are in the very far right of that line composed of those 3 units. So if you look at the red arrow, the farthest ones are the Texans. The 5th Texas is on the very far right. And in the meantime, Hood reported to Jackson that he could not hold this position unless he was reinforced. Okay. With the rest of Meade's division now taking position at the end of the cornfield and the 12th Corps advancing, the tide began to turn. At both ends of the cornfield, Hood's ranks were deteriorating and his men were running out of ammunition. The 5th Texas reported that they were stopped by the 10th Maine, who poured concentrated fire into their ranks, and you'll see the 10th Maine is that unit out in front of them. Now, there are a couple of accounts from the Texans that say they were receiving fire from Campbell's battery, and that's what helped decimate their ranks. However, Campbell's battery, as far as I understand, was at the far end of the cornfield, farther west. However, there was another battery they claimed they were receiving fire for, the 1st New York Light Battery of Pettit, who was part of the 2nd Corps. And they were not on this map, but they were farther beyond the east woods. Who can say, was Campbell's battery really firing over all of those other units to hit the 5th Texas? Who can say for certain, but it's possible, I suppose. Now, at 7:45, after an hour of sustained combat, Hood ordered his men to fall back, and by 9 a.m., what was left of the brigade was falling back into the west woods. Now, Turner, in his after-action report, wrote the following. He said, "My men are out of ammunition, the enemy not more than 100 yards in my front, no support, no ammunition. All our troops had fallen back on my left. I deemed it prudent to fall back also." So he doesn't really specify if he means just the 2 units that were to his immediate left or all the units of Hood's division were falling back. He doesn't really specify, but you can imagine in that position, if everybody else is leaving or out of ammunition, he doesn't have much of a choice. The Texas Brigade was in shambles. They helped stop the Union advance and held the line, allowing reinforcements to arrive, but at the cost of 560 of 854 men in the fight for the cornfield. Now, as far as the 5th Texas is concerned, 175 of those who stepped out into the field that day, 86 became casualties. 5 killed and 81 wounded at a casualty rate of about 50%. The regiment would see no more significant action the rest of that day. After the battle, Private Fielder of Company E wrote a melancholy letter home, and he said, "You said in your last letter that you hoped the Texans' thirst for Yankee blood had been partially quenched. I can speak for 3 in the Reg, that their thirst has not only been partially quenched, but they have been in so many fights and suffered so much, they are willing to never go into another fight again." We're in 1862 of September, and you can see the attitudes of the men are already starting to change. The war is beginning to wear on them, and they're beginning to see as much of the war as they cared to. Now, following the Battle of Antietam, Hood was promoted to Major General and given permanent command of the division. On November 1st, Colonel Robinson was promoted to Brigadier General and given command of the brigade. Lieutenant Colonel Robert M. Powell was then promoted to Colonel of the 5th. So what are we at, 4 or 5 different commanders now? Robert Mike Powell was born in 1826 in Montgomery County, Alabama. His family moved to Washington County, Texas in 1849. He first served as captain of Company D, and he was then promoted to major in August of 1862, and then lieutenant colonel by the end of 1862. Now you notice as we talk about the numbers of men that would go into this fight, they were started with 800, they were down to 300, it came back up to 300 again, went down to 150. So interesting thing happened, and you guys may have heard about this kind of stuff, but I wasn't aware. I was always under the impression that as the regiments were suffered losses from wounding and from sickness, that the regiments just continued to dwindle. However, Wigfall was sending messages back to Texas to say, send more replacements. So there were men coming from Texas who were not part of the original muster joining these regiments. Now, I don't know how much that happened during the war. I was always under the impression that once the regiment was formed, that was the regiment. However, this happened quite often. And of course, the numbers would fluctuate as well as men would return from being wounded or as being part of being sick on sick call. Now at Fredericksburg, the 5th Texas was lightly engaged, and by December 12th, they occupied the center of Lee's line south of Marie's Heights, and I don't really know how many casualties were suffered there, but we can assume not many. Now, the winter of 62-63, they were in Fredericksburg. However, in March of 63, they moved to Suffolk, Virginia on the Peninsula. The 2 divisions of Longstreet's Corps, Hood and Pickett, were sent there to counter a rumored Union advance. Captain Turner was mortally wounded, the commander at Antietam, and defending the entrance to the river near Norfolk. The regiment missed the Battle of Chancellorsville, one of the only major battles in the Eastern Theater that they missed. However, by the end of May, the Texans once again joined Lee's army. The 5th was still part of the 1st Corps, Hood's brigade, now commanded by Robertson, and the Army of Northern Virginia. All right, so now we're going to talk about Lee's second great invasion of the North in the Gettysburg campaign. So on July 2nd, hopefully you're very familiar with Longstreet's march to place his 2 divisions on the extreme left of the Union Army. Hood and McLaws were on the left flank, and the 5th arrived after a march of several miles, of course, with the rest of Longstreet's command, and formed about 4 p.m., and they advanced against the Union positions on the far right. We have a lot of detailed maps here, so we'll go through them. The 5th advanced against the Union positions on the right. The Texans first moved towards Big Round Top, advancing across its base. And then after consolidating their lines, and you can see the 5th, they are that big gap between the 2 lower ones, they're second from the top, advancing across the base of Big Round Top towards Little Round Top. After consolidating their lines, they hit the far right of Vincent's line, and Vincent would eventually, Weed would come in to the right of him. So you can see the 5th, this group of regiments here at the bottom, the 5th is like the 3rd one from the top. And they would move up to advance to what was basically the base of Little Round Top, and they were stuck there all day. They couldn't advance beyond Vincent and Weed's position at Little Round Top, and they just took fire all day long. The 1st Texas had advanced into the Devil's Den. It wasn't until darkness that they were able to pull themselves back off of Little Round Top, and then they spent the rest of the battle exchanging fire with sharpshooters. Now, for their trouble, the 5th Texas fought 409 men, so they had their strength back up to 409 at Gettysburg. However, they lost 54 killed, 112 wounded, and 45 missing or captured, including Colonel Powell, who was wounded at the summit and later captured. Lieutenant Colonel Bryan took over, and he was wounded almost immediately. The second time he happened, he took command once before and was wounded almost immediately. This left Major Jefferson C. Rogers in command. So what are we at? It's commander number 6 now? Jefferson C. Rogers was born in Lawrence County, Tennessee in 1824, and as a young man he traveled to Mississippi, where he enlisted in the United States Army and served in the Mexican War. He moved to Milham County, Texas in 1852, serving as county sheriff from 1854 to 58, a district clerk, and he also served as a Texas Ranger in the years before the war. In 1860, he helped form Company E, also known as the Dixie Blues. So what did the Texans think of their time in Pennsylvania? One Texan wrote, "Many of my intimate friends found their final resting place in the soil of Pennsylvania." And that was Private Joskins of Company A. Now, in September of 63, the Texas Brigade is transferred with Hood and McLaw's divisions to the Army of Tennessee. At Chickamauga, the Texas Brigade was heavily engaged with driving federal troops back to the Lafayette Road, if you're familiar with the Battle of Chickamauga, until they were stopped by Wilder's Federal Brigade with the help of their Colt repeating rifles. On the second day of battle, the brigade was part of the attack that advanced through a fatal gap in the Federal line and split the Federal army. Rosecrans made a huge mistake and ordered a unit out of the line, and the Texans marched right through it. A member of the brigade recalled the fight at Chickamauga, stating, "That was the meanest, most unsatisfactory place I struck during the whole war." The 5th Texas lost 12 killed, 87 wounded, and 12 missing out of 150 that they brought to the battle. Hood was badly wounded, and he would eventually find his way, stay back in the West for the remainder of the war. Evander Law took over the division. Now, Robertson was wounded, and of course, he was arrested by Longstreet. He got into a spat with Longstreet. Longstreet didn't think he was carrying out his orders quickly enough, so he had him arrested, and he was eventually sent back to Texas. And John Gregg, another Texan, took over the brigade. Now, Major Rogers was also wounded by shrapnel, losing his left eye, and was disabled from further command. And in April of 1864, after a short stay, and I know I'm blazing through this pretty quickly, but these guys were really busy. After a short stay in Knoxville, the regiment returned to Virginia with the rest of Longstreet's corps. John Gregg took command of the brigade after Chickamauga. Okay? Now, let's talk about the Overland Campaign and the Wilderness. So in the Battle of Wilderness, 1864, Lieutenant Colonel King Bryan commanded the regiment, charging with the Texas Brigade to plug a gap in the Confederate line near the intersection of the Orange Plank Road and the Brock Road. Bryan, commander number 7, I think we're on now, was a native of St. Mary Parish in Louisiana, moved to Texas when he was 16, fought in the War of Texas Independence, and then was a farmer and rancher in Liberty County, Texas, and county sheriff and state legislature. The counterattack was successful, and you can see I've got the arrow pointing to where Gregg's men are, and the 5th Texas was obviously part of that. The cost to the brigade was about half its strength. In 25 minutes of fighting, the 5th lost 111 men out of the 180 who answered the roll that morning. Bryan was wounded again in both arms, disabled and from future command. He would die of his wounds in 1866. And then Captain Tacitus T. Clay took over command of the regiment. And we'll talk about him in a second. But first, again, another piece of Texas Brigade lore. So those of you who are familiar with the Battle of the Wilderness, Longstreet is bringing his command in, and Lee wants them to attack the center of the line along the Orange Plank Road. And he sees these, who are those men, he says, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, the Texans, and Lee is very happy because he likes the Texans. And he says, "I will lead you into the fight." And the Texans say, nope, Lee, go to the rear. We won't go forward until Lee goes back. They're grabbing the bridle of his horse, saying, "No, you must go back, you must go back." Again, the 5th Texans claim that was them. They're the ones who stopped Lee from committing suicide at the Battle of the Wilderness. Again, who knows if it was really them. It could have been all of the entire brigade. It wasn't that large, so it could have easily been all of the Texans surrounding Lee. But again, another part of Texas Brigade lore. Now, Tass Clay, as he was called, of Company I, was born in 1824, and he came from an influential Texas family that could trace its roots back to Texas in 1799. His family had been in Texas that long, so he was a real Texan. He was a prominent businessman before the war and mayor of Independence, Texas, after the war. He wouldn't last, though, unfortunately. The regiment, however, saw its most intense fighting on May 10th during the Spotsylvania courthouse fight. They had now fewer than 100 men, so the replacements have stopped coming, and the regiment is beginning to deteriorate. We don't know how many casualties they had, but they were entrenched during most of the fight, so we can speculate that it wasn't that many. At the Battle of Cold Harbor, the 5th saw intense fighting, but again, suffering only light casualties. Gregg reported that after battle, he had only 430 men left in the whole brigade, and the arrow you see right there is pointing to where the 5th Texas was. Now, Captain Watson Williams of Company F wrote home talking about the Overland Campaign. He said, and I quote, "This is the 33rd day since fighting between these two armies has commenced. I am quite sure not a single day has passed without fighting of some kind somewhere on the line, and many days have been characterized by bloody battles." And this was true, so they would see almost sustained combat until they reached the outskirts of Richmond and Petersburg. Now, from late June until November, the 5th was either entrenching or fighting off Union attempts to break the Confederate line. At the Second Battle of Deep Bottom, the regiment suffered heavy casualties, charging Union troops armed with repeating carbines. Captain Clay was wounded, again, and Captain William T. Hill took over command, the 9th man to do so during the war. So, don't know how common that was, but they were going through commanders at a pretty terrific pace. He was born in 1837 in Alabama, moved to Walker County, Texas as a child, attended Austin College in Huntsville, and he was a farmer before the war. He joined Company D, 5th Texas, as a first lieutenant. He was wounded at Gettysburg at the Wilderness, but he returned every single time to command his company. And then from November until April, the 5th remained in the trenches near Petersburg with the rest of Lee's army. How are we doing on time? All right, not too bad. Now, on April 2nd, 1865, with the lines at Petersburg broken, let's see if I get here. The 5th, along with the rest of Lee's army, began the long retreat along the Appomattox River. Colonel Powell, who was wounded and captured at Gettysburg, returned to the regiment and was acting commanding officer. He and Hill shared command until the end of the war. We're not really sure how many engagements they fought. They did participate in the Battle of Sailor's Creek. It is reported that they didn't see significant combat, but I don't know how many casualties they suffered. Now, 6 days later, on September 8th, the regiment surrendered 12 officers, as I mentioned, and 149 enlisted men at Appomattox. They were the largest unit in the Texas Brigade, at 149 enlisted men. 93 of these 149 men were from the original 1861 muster. During the war, 1,450 men served in the 5th Texas. So the 800 original men that were mustered into the regiment, plus another, 650 that joined after the fact, and then all of the wounded, killed, missing, so on and so forth, left them with 149 when the war was over. After Appomattox, the men of the 5th began the long journey home. Some walked, some went by rail, some by steamboat, and some were conveyed by a combination of all three. Enduring weather and hunger along the way, one of the former members of the regiment wrote of the long, arduous journey home across the devastated South. He said, "I was so hungry, I could have eaten a piece of rubber boot." After returning to Texas, the survivors of the 5th picked up their ledgers, plows, textbooks, and got on with their lives. The brigade had 63 reunions, meeting up until 1933. And many of them continued after that. Now this brings us to the end, and now we have one other thing to answer. So if we recall at the beginning, Captain Chilton's lament, he said, "Has the world forgotten Hood's Texans?" And I will leave you with this visual to answer that question. He says, only part of the books that I was able to find that talked specifically about Hood and or his brigade, so probably one of the most written about units in the entire Civil War. And this is only a small representation of the books available if you want to read more about Hood and the 5th Texas. So Ike Turner, as I mentioned, was killed, after the Battle of Antietam. He was brevetted to major, and he was going to organize this company of sharpshooters. And the promotion never came into fruition, and on April 4th, near Suffolk, Virginia, he was fatally wounded by a Yankee bullet, according to the Confederates. And he died the next day. And one of his brothers claimed his body, and he was buried in the family's original home in Turnville near Midgeville, Georgia. Now, some 40 years later, there was a Sons of Confederate Veterans camp organized in Polk County, Texas. They called themselves the Ike Turner Camp, number 321. And as time passed, this was around the turn of the 19th century, they vowed they would find Captain Turner and bring him back to Texas because family lore held that he wanted to be buried in Texas. Of course, that's a Texas thing. Everybody assumes that everybody wants to be buried in Texas. Just ask Albert Sidney Johnston and the people of New Orleans, because they did the same thing to him. Now, they were skipping ahead to 1994. I don't think it took them 94 years to find Captain Turner, but that's when the next part of the story happens. There was a man in Georgia who was doing research and thought he knew where the family's old homestead was, their plantation. And so he started doing research, and he had read about these Texans looking for their captain. And he was out in the woods near where he thought the plantation was. The buildings were all gone. And he was digging through some, not really rubble, but overgrowth and brush. And he saw a bunch of periwinkles growing. Now, I'd heard this several times before, that if you're looking for abandoned graves, especially graves in cemeteries from the 19th century, look for perennials. Flowers, daffodils, things that grow every year, tulips, those kinds of things. It was not uncommon for folks to plant those, and in the spring you can see them coming up. So he went over these periwinkles, he parted the brush, and of course there's Captain Turner's headstone. He writes the Texans, they get permission to exhume the grave, whatever's left of Turner, and they put him in a box. And before Georgia lets him go, they have a celebration in the old governor's mansion. His body is held in state for 2 days and finally is put on a transport to send back to Texas. And then, of course, the folks in Livingston, the seat of Polk County, where Turner was living when he joined the Texans, also had a ceremony honoring him. The whole town turned out, and it was a giant ceremony, almost like a celebration, if you will. And after 150 some odd years, Ike Turner finally came home. This is Livingston, Texas, as it looked around the turn of the century when the Sons of Confederate Veterans unit was formed. That's his original tombstone, as it was in Georgia. That's another Texas historical marker marking the spot at J.A.S. Turner Cemetery, where he and his 3 brothers now reside. And of course, that is his new headstone in Texas. So even though he died many miles away, the Texans were determined to bring him home, and that's the journey of Ike Turner after he passed away. Thank you.